Morning, everyone. Here we go. Let's see here. I don't have any of the usual suspects here, but I expect a few to come. So here we go. So today, we're continuing our reading and commentary on the Red Book by C.G. Jung. My purpose here is not to lionize Jung's active imagination, but rather to give you a sense that these things can happen to you and give you some things to think about in that connection. And so what I'm going to do is begin the morning, Art. Good morning, Miss Dell. Nice to see you. So I'm just beginning. I'm on page 268 of the Red Book by C.G. Jung, the Reader's Edition. And the title that's in it now is The Remains of Earlier Temples, but there's a footnote. The handwritten draft has instead Sixth Adventure, and the corrected draft has instead Degenerate Ideals. And so what I'm going to do is read it and make sure that you understand that. As we know, we have lots of degenerate ideals or degenerated ideals in our society right now. And there's a couple of other footnotes here before I begin. One is the mosaic form resembles the mosaics at Ravenna, Italy, which Jung visited in 1913 and 1914, and which made a lasting impression on him. Now, the significance of that is that he was on a bicycle trip with a friend through northern Italy, and they decided to stop to see these mosaics in Ravenna. And at that time, the mosaics did not exist. So the mosaics that he thought he saw were actually a vision of his. And thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. And it wasn't until years later he was remembering the mosaics, and it wasn't until years later that somebody wrote to him or wrote to one of his sidekicks and said, please tell Dr. Jung that those mosaics were destroyed in the, 13th or 14th century, and they're not there anymore. But Jung's memory of them was that they were there entirely. One other footnote here, the date is January 5th, 1914. So from the beginning of the Red Book, we're now on page 268, and we have only passed less than 2 weeks since Christmas 1913, which is when the real visioning of the Red Book began. And we're just over halfway through the Red Book. So Dr. Jung knew that these events that happened to him in a very quick period were important, and that he needed to pay attention to him. And indeed, later on, he says that these were the prima materia, the primary material, base material of his whole life of writing. And so any case, and here's Jordan. So Jordan, you're just in time. I'm about to begin. Welcome.
Morning.
Morning. So I'm going to begin reading here, and you can just enjoy your coffee for a moment. Okay, so the remains of earlier temples. Yet another new adventure occurred. Wide meadows spread out before me, a carpet of flowers, soft hills, a fresh green wood in the distance. I come across two strange journeymen, probably two completely accidental companions, an old monk and a tall, gangly, thin man with a childish gait and discolored red clothes. As they draw near, I recognize the tall one as the Red Rider. How he has changed. He has grown old. His red hair has become gray. His fiery red clothes are all worn out, shabby, poor. And the other, he has a paunch and appears not to have fallen on bad times, but his face seems familiar by all the gods. It's Ammonius. What changes? And where are these utterly different people coming from? I approach them and bid them good day. Both look at me frightened and make the sign of the cross. Their horror prompts me to look down at myself. I am fully covered in green leaves, which spring from my body. I greet them a second time, laughing. Now the active imagination begins. Ammonius exclaims, horrified, Agape Satanas, the red one, damned pagan riffraff. I. But my dear friends, what's wrong? Pardon?
Apage rather than agape.
Apage Satanas. Okay, you're right.
Which is begone.
Huh?
Which is begone.
Okay, Apage Satanas, says Ammonius. And of course, he's walking with the red one. The red one says, damned pagan riffraff. I. But my friends, what's wrong with you? I'm the Hyperborean stranger who visited you. Oh, Ammonius in the desert. And I'm the watchman whom you, red one, once visited. Ammonius. So let me read a footnote here. What is the footnote of saying begone Satan, which is a common expression from the Middle Ages. And footnote 84, the Hyperboreans were a race of Greek mythology who lived in a land of sunshine beyond the north wind, worshiping Apollo. Nietzsche referred on several occasions to the free spirits as Hyperboreans. The Antichrist, section 1, Twilight of the Idols, the Antichrist, by R. Hollander, London Penguin, 1990, page 127. Okay, so that's what the Hyperboreans were. So,
and he had become he had become the green man, basically, with the leaves all coming out of him.
Right. And would you remind us of what the green man is, since I don't remember?
It's basically, you're talking about the masculine quality of Gaia, as it would be, all of nature in a being, is my understanding.
Okay, and there's a green one, of course, in the Quran, in Surah 18, which contains Moses meeting the green one in the Quran. So I'm going to go on. Ammonius, I recognize you, you supreme devil. My downfall began with you. The red one looks at him reproachfully and gives him a poke in the ribs. The monk sheepishly stops. The red one turns haughtily toward me. Red one. Already at that time, I couldn't help thinking that you lacked a noble disposition, notwithstanding your hypocritical seriousness. You damned Christian play act. At this moment, Ammonius pokes him in the ribs, and the red one falls into an embarrassed silence. And thus Both stand before me, sheepish and ridiculous, and yet pitiable. I, wherefrom, man of God, what outrageous fate has led you here, let alone in the company of the Red One? Ammonius, I would prefer not to tell, but it does not appear to be a dispensation of God that one can escape. So know then that you, evil spirit, have done me a terrible deed. You seduced me with your accursed curiosity, desirously stretching my hand after the divine mysteries, since you made me conscious at that time that I really knew nothing about them. Your remark that I probably needed the closeness of men to arrive at the higher mystery stunned me like infernal poison. Soon thereafter, I called the brothers of the valley together and announced to them that a messenger of God had appeared to me. So terribly had you blinded me and commanded me to form a monastery with my brothers. When Brother Philetus raised an objection, I refuted him with a reference to the passage in the Holy Scriptures where it is said that it is not good for a man to be alone. And that's footnote 85, a reference to Genesis 2:18. And the Lord God said, it is not good for the man it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him. There is one reference to a Philetus in the Bible, 2 Timothy 16-18, quote, but shun profane and vain babbling, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their word will eat as doth a canker. Of the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Okay. So we founded the monastery near the Nile, from where we could see the passing ships. We cultivated fat fields, and there was so much to do that the Holy Scriptures fell into oblivion. We became voluptuous, and one day I was filled with such terrible longing to see Alexandria again. I talked myself into believing that I wanted to visit the bishop there. But first I was intoxicated so much by life on the ship and then by the milling crowds on the streets of Alexandria that I became completely lost. As in a dream, I climbed onto a large ship bound for Italy. I felt an insatiable greed to see the world. I drank wine and saw that women were beautiful. I wallowed in pleasure and wholly turned into an animal. Then I climbed ashore in Naples. The Red One stood there, and I knew that I had fallen into the hands of evil. The Red One, be silent, old fool. If I had not been present, you would have become an outright pig. When you saw me, you finally pulled yourself together, cursed the drinking and the women, and returned to the monastery. Okay, so at this point, I want to point out that the monastery that he may be referring to, although I don't know if it's inside of the ships, is the St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert. And it's a very famous monastery, which I had never heard of until I was in Qatar one time, and an engineer in the Hamad Medical Center, who was Egyptian, was going to get married, and he was going to take his new wife on a tour of Sinai and was going to go visit this St. Catherine's Monastery, which has existed since the 4th or 5th century. And it's famous because the very first image we have of Jesus Christ is an image called Sinai Jesus, which you can look up on Google, Sinai Jesus. It's the image in which Jesus has one eye looking inside and one eye looking outside. So he's looking at the unconscious and he's looking at the conscious world simultaneously. And that became very meaningful to me. I asked Tim Holmes to put that reference to the first portrait that I asked him to paint of me, which he did. And I was speaking of this monastery only this morning in an email to one of our friends. So anyway,
also too, the two directional eyes, rather than just unconscious and conscious, is also the one looking out is rational, aware, seeing around, external, and the other one is the creative drive that's always plugged inside, and that they both have to be present for one complete being.
right. Okay, so carrying on with the quote, I'm still within the red one's response. Now hear my story, damn hobgoblin. I too fell into your snare, and your pagan arts also enticed me. After the conversation of that time, where you caught me in the fox trap with your remark about dancing, I became serious, so serious that I went into the monastery, prayed, fasted, and converted myself. In my blindness, I wanted to reform the church liturgy, and with the bishop's approval, I introduced dancing. I became abbot, and as such, alone had the sole right to dance before the altar, like David before the Ark of the Covenant. But little by little, the brothers also began to dance, indeed, even the congregation of the faithful, and finally the whole city danced. It was terrible. I fled into solitude and danced all day until I dropped, but in the morning the hellish dance began again. I sought to escape from myself and strayed and wandered around at night. In the daytime, I kept myself secluded and danced alone in the forest and deserted mountains. And thus gradually I came to Italy. Down there in the south, I no longer felt as I had felt in the north. I could mingle with the crowds. Only in Naples did I somewhat find my way again, and there I also found this ragged man of God. His appearance gave me strength. Through him, I could regain my health. You've heard how he took heart from me, too, and found his way again. Ammonius. I must confess I did not fare so badly with the red one. He's a toned down type of devil. The red one says, I must add that the monk is hardly the fanatical type, although I've developed a deep aversion against the whole Christian religion since my experience in the monastery. Dear friends, it does my heart good to see you enjoying yourselves together. Both. We are not pleased, mocker and adversary. Clear off, you robber, pagan. But why are you traveling together if you're not enjoying each other's company and friendship? Ammonius, what can be done? Even the devil is necessary, since otherwise one has nothing that commands a sense of respect with the people. And there's a footnote. In Chronicles 1:15, David dances before the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, then the red one says, well, I need to come to an arrangement with the clergy, or else I will lose my clientele. Therefore, the necessities of life have brought you together. So let's make peace and be friends, both. But we can never be friends. I see. The system is at fault. You probably want to die out first. Now let me pass, you old ghosts. So anyway, I'll stop there for the time being. Jordan.
I think what jumps at me is what can be done. Even the devil is necessary, since otherwise one has nothing that commands a sense of respect with people. So in a sense, this is adolescent. This is not, I mean, I don't think it's a toned down devil. I think it's a young one, where the gluttony that we've seen before in dancing and drinking, and then that commands a sense of respect with people. That's biting into a love of power and thinking that fear is the only way to get respect, when silence is different than making people quiet. So I think that it's interesting here that he's running through this, but now let me pass you, old ghosts. The apparition piece there is interesting because they're subject to their circumstances. You know, they're saying nothing can be done. Well, they haven't seen past, I think, the powerful limits of what they've seen before, in a way.
Yeah. And obviously, we have here the opposites, which cannot escape one another. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
And
clarified the Gaia piece, the male Gaia with the green man. That, to be fair, I think that was a little vague of me. The reality is it's a symbol of birth, death, and resurrection. But in the green man, it's nature presented as a uniquely complete being. But that is all birth, death, and resurrection at one time, much like a garden with legs walking around. So
yeah. Did we do a commentary on Answer to Job? I think we did we not? A couple years back.
We did.
Yeah. So there is a commentary to Answer to Job on this YouTube channel, and it is available to you if you really have to hear our commentary.
Yeah, I think we did synchronicity last in a causal principle, and then I think Job was right. Answer to Job was right before that.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway,
what are your thoughts on this? Because it's an interesting interchange between the three of them here, where the two keep answering together and Jung is answering individually.
Well, I think that Jung is starting to come into his stride as he starts to communicate with these figures in his unconscious. I think at the beginning, he was somewhat surprised by them, but here he seems to have caught his stride and is prepared to talk to them, and as a result get their wisdom, which is actually his wisdom, but it's hidden in his unconscious.
Right.
And so he's realized that by this point, and mind you, this is less than 2 weeks after he started the active imaginations.
Right.
He's realized by this point that they contain wisdom that he doesn't have access otherwise. And so he just decides to go with the flow. And
he's about 42.
No, it's 1914, so he's 39.
Yeah, so he's running into that range of that 42-year-old. The adult opens up to birth the rest of their life kind of thing, from the very much the Queen of Cups. All the feelings and emotions and wisdom you need are buried within yourself.
Okay, I'm just going to leave the YouTube chat to itself here and proceed on.
Okay.
So when I had seen death and all the terrible solemnity that is gathered around it, I had become ice and night myself. An angry life and impulse rose up in me. My thirst for the rushing water of the deepest knowledge began to clink with wine glasses from afar. I heard drunken laughter, laughing women and street noise. Dance music, stamping and cheering poured forth from all over. And instead of of the rose-scented south wind, the reek of the human animal streamed over me. Luscious, lewd horrors giggled and rustled along the walls. Wine fumes and the kitchen steam and the foolish cackling of the human crowd drew near in a cloud. Hot, sticky, tender hands reached out for me, and I was swaddled in the covers of a sickbed. I was born into life from below, and I grew up as heroes do, in hours rather than years. And after I had grown up, I found myself in the middle land and saw that it was spring.
And there's that birth, death, and resurrection in just hours rather
Right.
than that he's really dialing into.
Right. And he's definitely seeing that the duality and the middle way is the way everything works. And this is why he became so interested in Tibetan Buddhism, because the Tibetans had locked themselves in caves for 1,000 years or so. And when they came out, they basically said the same things as Carl Jung said.
And this whole paragraph, that, luscious, lewd, horrors giggled and rustled along the walls, wine fumes and kitchen steam and foolish cackling of the human crowd drew near in a cloud. One, he's rhyming, and in a way, and two, with internal rhyme, but then the hot, sticky, tender hands reached out for me, swaddled in the covers of a sick bed. So in a sense, he's birthing the lotus from the mud.
Right. And he's breaking the fever.
Right.
Yeah. And so, if we apply this to ourselves, we can see it happening in the collective of the United States here with, lots of things bubbling up right now, but the fever is starting to break, it seems. And
I can look at this just from how miserable I was in the last part of Philadelphia, and it had nothing to do with Philadelphia. I was just wrongly placed there, and by myself. But it's interesting because then there was that awakening of, oh, it's time to go. So it's time to grow. And then, changed. And it wasn't a change for, I'm going to do this differently. It was, you literally emerge.
Right.
So the birth out of.
So the significance of this is that this isn't just a quaint fairy tale that happened to a middle-aged psychiatrist in Zurich 100 years ago. This is the phenomenon that occurs to all of us. And what Jung is doing here by preparing the Red Book is he's saying to us we should be preparing our own Red Book. It's going to be different, and he never said that clearly, but he did say we should create our own Red Book, and the result is that it'll be, when you do that, when you start to open in that way, other things just open up naturally before you. And, that definitely has happened for me over many years, but certainly since I've started this YouTube channel, where I've been forced, like any teacher, to go back and say, now, what are they saying here? And the result of it is I've been able to stay one week ahead of my class, which is the teacher's gift, I guess.
Yeah.
And
that's far enough, so you don't lose them.
Right. And let's see. MK1's Dionysus says the so-called unconscious inferences can be traced back to all preserving memory, which presents us with parallel experiences and hence already knows the consequences of an action. It is not anticipation of the effects, rather it is the feeling identical causes, identical effects generated in a mnemonic image. Okay, I can't deny that. Elvis became an Elvis impersonator. Lennon is the king. Clunk. What a clown house. Yeah. Yeah. Elvis became an Elvis impersonator. And at some level, maybe, I mean, if you see the movie Elvis, you really have to have empathy for the man, as well as the myth. And
I think so. He turned a whole lineage like an emperor turns an empire by going just in one step a different direction. And that's a tough act to self-follow. And the problem with that, it's, I think, not so much performance anxiety, it's, oh, well, does my next idea have to be so big? And I think that he just rode the wave of the ocean that he created. But I think that's an apt point that Elvis became an Elvis impersonator, because as he began aging, his act was aging, and he wasn't keeping up with where was his creativity.
Right. And he felt he was imprisoned by his act.
Yeah.
And that's
and that's marketing. That's marketing and listening to your manager too much, where you're the reason they're there. And in that sense, they need to kind of zip the mouth and support the follow through rather than tell you what you need to continue to do. So in a sense, he self-employed without running his own business. And so that's danger. That's a danger.
Yeah. And Michael says you never know when the big breakthrough will happen. And what I would say is that the breakthrough may be lots of mini breakthroughs. And it doesn't happen all at once. And we gradually find where we should be in life. And I've definitely seen Jordan evolve over the last 5 years, as he was quite miserable in Philadelphia. And I think Jordan has gained a new respect among many of the people that I work with. And we're looking forward to having him
thank you
in the fall at our confluence.
I liked your statement of the many little breakthroughs, because a lot of people, want this drastic change. The problem when drastic change comes, even if it's good, it still kind of destroys people. And because it destroys what you had before, even if it's for the positive. And there's a whole piece, I think the quote I remember was, I don't remember who it was. Oh yeah, I was an overnight success after 47 years of hard work.
Yeah, right.
And it's the kind of thing you don't see the background, and the inspiration only comes when you're working. So you can't, as my joke is, someone sitting on the couch smoking hope. There's a narcotic of hope rather than an actual invigorating,
right.
hope.
I mean, you have to get into life, right?
Yeah.
You got to get, as the saying of the 90s was, you got to get a life, man.
You can't win the race on the couch, and then winning becomes not the thing. It's what are you in service to? What value bring you?
Right. And so this is, and Michael says feeding him drugs too, which is what happened to Elvis. And so he got in the clutches of a unscrupulous manager who drugged him up every night so that he could go out on stage and and do his thing again, but it ultimately killed him at age 43.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful of the drugs we drink, even metaphorically. And you know, my revelation only comes in with 2020 hindsight, as I started to study Jung, and as I did, it became more and more relevant to my life starting in 1987. And in retrospect, with 2020 hindsight, I can see a bright red line from the time I broke my leg at Marine Corps Base Quantico to today. But if I told you the whole story, which I have done over years now, sort of, it wouldn't be it's not a heroic story. It's a story of just, I needed a shrink probably, and Jung became my shrink. And, over time, because I'm so intuitive and I didn't have so much time because I flew around the world 75 times between 1990 and 2013. I spent a lot of time in the stratosphere, had a lot of time to think and to read. And it all started to come together for me in 2010. I was still searching for how I would do it. And I finally started the website, archetypeinaction.com, which I've paid less attention to the last few years. But it turned out that this YouTube channel has become what I've been driven to. And
I like the incremental, and this whole series of paragraphs of getting stuck in a place. I mean, I remember 1991, 2, and 3 painting prolifically in oil and watercolor while writing and reading. And then 1996, still painting, but I dialed back into architecture. And honestly, still painting, still writing, then add architecture. I was over focused, workaholic times 3.
Right.
And what happens is then they all started to dry up in different ways. And I think there was important to have that kind of immersion, but at the same time, it grew me. And, the single-minded focus in 3 different directions, which sounds a little weird, but was an initiation. And then it didn't have to always be so boom, boom, boom intense. You start to notice the subtle and the nuance more, like, oh, look at the flower, and their whole world stops. And it reminds me of Georgia O'Keeffe when the reporter says, Miss O'Keeffe, why did you paint your flowers so big? And she said, everybody looks. I would like them to see. So she's bringing the, image right up into the face. So I think the subtle and the nuance, the noticing those details, but coming in and out of the large and the small were important.
So Alexander has asked a very good question, which I'll let you answer first, Jordan. He says, hey guys, I've been watching your channel for quite a while. Great work. I'd like to ask something. I feel very alien to my own energies. Is there anything I can do to feel more control?
Not knowing specifics, so answering it probably a bit in the abstract, I would look at first, don't worry so much about your nouns and your topics, because those don't change much through life as quickly, but look at your verbs, and especially that last one, the control, and try to make more living verbs. Control is somewhat static, and if you change control to navigate, you might start to open yourself up and not be so constricted. Sometimes I think some of my clients, they'll feel alien, but what it is they held on to something too long. They think that they're trying to do the same thing and get better at it, but the thing moved on. And so they are squeezing a smaller and smaller heart of the matter, just because, not because it's less and less, because the Doppler, you stopped and your heart kept going. So I would suggest to dial into your verbs and see how you can immerse more in your own heart of the matter and see where you actually are now rather than where you think you should be, to try to explain as a thought.
Right. And also be conscious about what you're being told. Okay. In other words, and so Alexander, I would say that part of my answer is that you've already started to do that with your question. Okay. And so answer that question for yourself, I would say. That may take a period of years. I can't say that there's there's not a one sentence answer to the question. But, in my own life, I can say that, when I was in college, I didn't think I was smart enough to go to law school. And one of the reasons was that I went to a very tough little Ivy school, and I was getting a lot of C's, and I didn't think that I could get into law school, so I went in the Marines instead, which was my family business. And then I ended up getting plopped into a C hut with 3 lawyers: the chief judge, the chief trial counsel, and the chief defense counsel of the 1st Marine Division all lived with me for a period of 3 months. And they worked on me and told me I had to go to law school, and I better get my butt in gear to get the applications in while I was in Vietnam. So I did that. And much to my surprise, I got accepted. And it turned out that, my college gave C's where other colleges give A's. So it turned out I was fairly smart after all. And
I think that's a great example too for the question in regards to looking at what's relative, what you believe from other people. And also what came to me while Skip was going through his example was the idea of transformation. I kind of wondered, does the caterpillar start to feel alien to itself before it, for no reason, climbs up a twig, spins the chrysalis, and becomes a butterfly? So there's always a postpartum to creative acts, not a depression, but a low energy period. I often wonder if there's a prepartum where people sometimes fall into somewhat of a depression, but the reality is it's because your body, your mind, your psyche is clearing out the space for you to run differently. So maybe look right at the alien piece, but kind of take my biggest joke is, well, validation is just for parking, and watch what other people say, and don't explain yourself away. Live yourself into your way. So I think less planning and more doing, that you'll start to notice how you're doing things differently, and that'll give you the handholds to keep on getting traction.
Right. And so in my case, I really loved going to law school. I loved the intellectual stimulation, and I worked very hard at it. And so I got myself a good job at the end of law school in a major law firm. And so that 3 years I loved. But within 3 years of starting to practice law, I literally detested the profession. I detested it. And I probably in 2.5 years, I saw an ad for an executive MBA program. And so I decided, I think I want to be in business, not practicing law. So I better go to business school. So I applied, and it turned out I was the 2nd lawyer to ever go to that executive MBA program. And so after 5 years of practicing law, I got my MBA, and I immediately took a job in Japan, building a company there, and picked up my family, closed up my law practice, and went to Japan. And the rest is history. A lot of things happened to me over my business career, but one of them, which I'm very proud of, is that I took a company public in 2005. I achieved that. And shortly after that, I lost everything in the crash of 2008. So you never know what's going to be stopping you in your life. And I didn't give up the Marine Corps. I kept one arm in it and served another 20 years in reserve. And then, God came along and smote me on Marine Corps Base Quantico, broke my leg. And it was the last thing I did officially in uniform. And
you just reminded me something else for, I think, the question of I'm feeling alien.
Right.
That I think applies is that with the 2008, I remember May 5th, 2008, between noon and 12:42, 3.5 years of work under contract disappeared.
Mhm.
What's interesting is right before the phone started ringing, and it was one of those when the phone rings, I mean, in an architecture firm, if the phone's not ringing, you got a problem. You need it to be ringing. That means you have work. But that day, as soon as the phone rang, I looked over and just went, I just knew. It's like, oh, that's not the right call. I mean, you just feel. And
Yeah, sure.
but what was interesting is I had just opened the box from DHL from
Mhm.
Canada for my first set of tarot decks. So I'm sitting there holding a shrink wrap deck in my hand, and for 42 minutes it stayed up there. And I looked over and talk about alien. This wasn't my hand anymore. In a sense, it was basically going, excuse me, excuse me,
Right.
excuse me. Everything else is going to hell, and you're going to hell in a handbasket. What's all this wicker, and why is it getting so hot?
Right.
But then
So
you turn around and see something. So I would look for something maybe you're already doing that is so natural.
Maybe not though. I mean, the crazy thing is, I answered the call in my county to teach this past year, and I answered it late, so I had to spend a year doing substitute teaching. But the irony of the last year's work as a substitute teacher was that I spent the last 3 months as the art teacher for 2nd to 5th grade in my school. Now, if you had asked me even a year ago if I ever would be an art teacher in an elementary school, I would have said, you got to be kidding me, right? No way. And yet, when I actually did it in the event, I actually loved it. Okay. I mean, I didn't love the combat that was involved in it because I taught in a school where everybody's a bully. So looking for the bully and trying to correct the bully is just a non sequitur at that school. But
trying to spoon out the ocean. It's like
you
right. May want a bigger boat,
Right. But I actually had a lot of fun with it. And this year, as we're preparing for Confluence, and I put the link for Confluence up above in the YouTube chat. One of the things that we're going to do is a group Rocky mural. And it's something that no one that I know of has ever done, including, what is that?
I'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah. It's something that no one that I know of ever has done. We're planning to do it in the fall. And I decided, wow, somebody's just given me 300 kids to experiment with. So I think I'll make a Rocky mural. And lo and behold, I did it. And it came out wonderfully as a way to connect with the collective unconscious. And it became, believe it or not, the backdrop for 5th grade graduation from this elementary school, which was actually beyond my wildest dreams and a bit of a coup, I would say. But anyway, I think I'll share that with you because it's quite amusing.
And also, I think in response to that question of feeling alien, did we provide anything of value that you see to use? I think I'd ask back to the one who commented about feeling alien.
Right. So here's the elementary school mural. Let's see, I have to do share screen. Hello, where's my Zoom meeting? Okay, here we go. All right, so I'll just quickly share this and then we'll move on. But this is 24 feet long and 3.5 feet tall. And I actually had every child in the school make a contribution to it, and many staff members as well. So I would say 650 people have touched this with paint. And as you see here, it is set up behind the 5th grade class. And this is the total setup for the day in the gymnasium of the school. Check the murals, by the way. But anyway, that was the result. And so I was really astounded that they would want this to be as the backdrop for their graduation ceremony for the 5th grade, but they did. And it represents the collective unconscious of that school. And if you look at it closely, one of the things that I did with the kids was I had them, whatever. I made them look at it closely and find what images they could find in it. And we ultimately found over 300 images in it. And these were elementary school students. And my estimate is there's probably 1,000
or even
images.
More. Or even more. I've said this before, but I think Tim confirmed when I said it before. We were both, I think, thinking the same thing, but when it popped up, it looked like the Milky Way in a dark night sky. Yeah. If you're out in the desert, like Chaco Canyon,
sure.
And you have no lights, and so you were seeing the sky the same as someone did 10 or 20,000 years ago, and that Milky Way is something they would, wake up to and go to sleep to every night or every morning. So, yeah, it feels like you guys created a natural phenomenon. Beyond the conscious is like, oh, look, you created another Milky Way. It's just 3.5 feet tall and 24 feet long.
Right. And so it was anyway, I think it may be the first Rocky mural, and it's very likely the first Rocky mural that's been painted on by 650 people.
Right.
I only gave the kids 1 minute each to paint on it, but that was still more than 10 hours of painting that went into the mural before we started to outline the images or outline and mind you, the paint goes on in a totally random fashion, totally random. And then you draw lines with a dark gel pen or a ultrafine Sharpie. You draw lines between all the color boundaries, and we didn't even get that completed in that mural. But for example, Yoda showed up twice in the mural. Among many other things that appeared, and some of them just made me chuckle. It was so funny.
Yoda and Baby Yoda. maybe.
Yeah, well, Baby Yoda was there also, definitely,
Okay.
and lots of many of other things. And so
It's funny about Baby Yoda, actually. Something I don't think I've ever said out loud, but I kind of wonder if Yoda once looked like Luke Skywalker, or Han Solo, or anybody else, but was 800 years old. You kind of shrink a little bit, So I kind of wonder if he was a different being. Did he always look like that, or did he shrink and turn green? So anyway,
right,
just
right.
random.
And Michael says, as you have presented, some art skill might help us create our own red book. And you don't even have to have art skill. I mean, what I'm doing now with my Rocky work is I'm not doing it for presentation per se. I'm just randomly putting down paint on various pieces of paper. I think I can show you the one I'm about to work on. This is it. And I'm using Saks liquid watercolor paint, which is not strictly speaking the primary colors, but they give you 8 colors in that. And then what you do is you just draw lines every place you see a boundary between colors, and immediately images start to emerge, for me anyway.
I think instead of skill, too, that's a good point. Instead of skill, look at a baby starting to walk for the first time.
Right.
They are not afraid of failure. That's not even anywhere near. There's this curiosity, this wonderment. Everybody else seems to be up on 2 feet, so they start trying.
Right.
And I think that's kind of a good metaphor for how to navigate change in your life. It's not a fear of failure. It's you're learning to walk again. But if you can get that curiosity and wonderment going in it, and like the Rocky, where you're going to discover just by the pen, your actions, you learn to walk again differently. And so I think there's not a leaving the past, but don't fear the performance. Just
Right.
learn to walk. And if you look at babies, they'll wobble, back and forth very evidently. And if you look at an advanced yogini who's standing completely still, no, they're not. It's just so micro, the harmonic of the pendulum, because the only thing that stands totally still is something that's dead. So, you look for, how do you learn to walk again in different ways? And I think then what happens is, instead of I need skill to do this, you develop skill by doing it. And you don't have to judge how good you are. It's that you are doing it, I think, is the most important part. Like the Rocky, you lay it down and then you find out. So it's not planning. It's, in a sense, it's not even anti-planning. It's walking down a path.
And so what I'm finding is that it is for me, it's a terrific meditation technique. I just focus on drawing those lines, and at or near the end of it, I find images in it. And that's when I stop, or that's when I look back and see, okay, what else does it need? And I add that thing or those things, and then I stop and give it a name, okay? Because it's Colleen's dictum, and I think she's right, that whenever you do a work of art, you have to name it. That's
you birth something, so
part of the creative process. And so that's what I've been doing. And when I do that, I'm looking at a snapshot, boom, of my unconscious. And I don't know if anyone will ever care about this stuff. If you come to Confluence 23, you'll participate in a group Rocky like we did at the school. But at the end of it, we're going to cut it up and randomly give out pieces of it to each participant. And so everyone will have participated, I hope, because only in that way do we get a picture of the collective unconscious as a group. But then all of us will be able to take a piece of it home and have a piece of something that was touched by around 50 people, at least 50 people who are adults, by the way. So I'm not limiting adults to 1 minute on it. In fact, what I found is that 24 feet is quite a task. And so I hope 50 adults will each spend more time than the kids spend on both painting and outlining. But at the end of it, we're going to have something that's extremely powerful from the collective unconscious of that group in that particular weekend in October 23. And we're all going to take a piece of it home. And the power of that is going to be so phenomenal. I just can't emphasize enough how important I think it is. So
I think you brought up one of the hidden pieces, Colleen's notion to make sure you name it. What's hidden in that is that the birth is complete. And so there's a point where you do stop and maybe comfortable with the not knowing. You may not need to know why, but you can feel, okay, done. And then you begin the process of naming because the birth has occurred. I think looking at that milestone in the moment is important to be able to move to the next place. And I think the naming gives you the credence to yourself to pull away and say done. Because I remember the first ink wash I did that was honestly, I got tingles and it was beautiful and it was amazing. And the teacher stopped behind me. He said nothing. He kept walking. So I thought, well, he's the expert, so I must not be finished. By the time he came, and I was using this black and white Oil of Olay magazine thing. So it's real contrasty, but more calligraphy and gesture. And it just embraced the feeling. By the time he came back around, it was acneed and trashed and way too many brush strokes. And he started chuckling, and I turned around and I said, what? He goes, you don't need approval. And you just had to touch it, didn't you? You just had to touch it. He goes, yeah, it's beauty, but you need to learn to turn your brush so that's not the brush end. If you're going to get yourself, you just had to touch it. So I destroyed it, because it's so amazing. I must continue. And I should have. On the
other hand, a teacher can destroy it. I was taking a pastel portrait class one time, and I'm painting this guy who's sitting as a model for us with pastels, and the teacher comes up to me and behind me and says, "Oh, you've got to do this, and you got to do that, and you got to do this." And I just turned around to her and said, "No, I don't."
Right.
And that was the last class I took with her. I just couldn't stand being with that person again. And so, Alexander, when you say I feel out of touch with my archetypal energies, there are lots and lots of ways to get in touch with your archetypal energies. You can go to spiritual events, either church or synagogue or what have you, or a temple, or you can just learn to meditate without spiritual. I had my 300 kids all do mandalas at one point, and I never once mentioned that a mandala was about meditation or had any spiritual meaning whatsoever, or was mentioned in any religion, although it's in every religion. Mandalas in every religion. And of course, it's the rose window at the Cathedral of Chartres and all other cathedrals for that matter.
Well, and
But
there, maybe be more conscious of your breath. Give your
yeah,
heart enough breathing room, literally aspirate it. And when I say that, it sounds overgeneralized, but you might also watch, do you hold your breath when you're anticipating or in any way have light terror or anything? Because what happens is you're doing a subtle dying. Like if I hide under this leaf long enough, the predator will go away. And I notice with a lot of clients, there's a point in difficulty. Some of them start to breathe more deeply and they live their way through it. Some people immediately, their mouth trap just snaps shut and they're holding their breath. So I would think, look at how you breathe and let that be your identity of how you can help yourself navigate. Because the archetypes,
that's one meditation technique.
Yeah, just one. There's so
meditation many. is one way to get in touch with your energies. Being, taking up an art class can start to get you and connect you. I've described how to do Rockies. You can do that easily on a paper bag and with a cheap watercolor set for less than $10. You can try it. And you don't need me to teach you how to do it any further than what I've said. And the point is that you want to start to feel what those energies actually are. And you have to stop long enough to hear it, to see it, to know what it is. And that's the power of what I've learned since April with this Rocky technique, which for me, it's a better meditation technique than any meditation technique I've learned in Buddhism in 30 years. And I live with, for all intents and purposes, a Buddhist Lama. She never took our ordination, but she has done the 3-year retreat that makes you a Lama. So, so I've done a lot of Buddhist meditation work, and I finally figured out how things affect me and how I know what's coming from the unconscious. And this Rocky technique, I'm doing one every day, and it's only for me. I will have some of them at Confluence in a binder that if anybody is thrilled with, they can take with them for a small price. But I'm seeing it as mainly for me, as a way to meditate and where things come to me while I'm doing it that are important, and as a snapshot of what my unconscious is, because when I name it, that means I see something in it. And what I've found is that I can find, if every time I turn one of these things 90 degrees, I see something else and I call it something else. So usually I put the name of it on the bottom, but then on the back you can find, you can set it up so you can hang it any which way you want. You just decide which is your way. And you can change it every week. But the point is to do it for yourself, not to do it for someone else. So anyway, I want to get back to this. So we are at
page 134.
Right. No, we're on page 272. He's shouted, "Let me pass you, old ghosts." Okay. Top of 272. Okay. I don't know where you are, but we're in remains of other temples, and we're in part 2 now. This is the beginning of part 2 of it. When I had seen death and all the terrible solemnity that is gathered around it, and have become ice and night myself. An angry life and impulse rose up in me. My thirst for the rushing water of the deepest knowledge began to clink with wine glasses from afar. I heard drunken laughter, laughing women and street noise, dance music, stamping and cheering poured forth from all over, and instead of the rose-scented south wind, the reek of the human animal streamed over me. Luscious lewd whores giggled and rustled along the walls. Wine fumes and kitchen stream and the foolish cackling of the human crowd drew near in the cloud. Hot, sticky, tender hands reached out for me, and I was swaddled in the covers of a sickbed. I was born into life from below, and I grew up as heroes do, in hours rather than years. And after I had grown up, I found myself in the middle land and saw that it was spring. But I was no longer the man I had been, for a strange being grew through me. This was a laughing being of the forest, a leaf-green daemon, a forest goblin and prankster, who lived alone in the forest and was itself a greening tree being, who loved nothing but greening and growing, who was neither disposed nor indisposed toward men, full of mood and chance, obeying an invisible law, and greening and wilting with the trees, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither good nor bad, merely living, primordially old and yet completely young, naked and yet naturally clothed, not man but nature, frightened, laughable, powerful, childish, weak, deceiving and deceived, utterly inconstant and superficial, and yet reaching deep down to the kernel of the world. I had absorbed the life of both of my friends. A green tree grew from the ruins of the temple. They had not withstood life, but seduced by life, had become their own monkey business. They had got caught in the muck, and so they called the living a devil and the traitor, because both of them believed in themselves and in their own goodness, each in his own way. They ultimately became mired in the natural and conclusive burial ground of all outlived ideals. The most beautiful and the best, like the ugliest and the worst, end up someday in the most laughable place in the world, surrounded by fancy dress and led by fools, and go horror-struck to the pit of filth. And this is about outlived ideals. So, Jordan.
Yeah, I think that goes right back to the Doppler heart piece I mentioned before, where people squeezing and trying to hold on to something that was successful or valuable in such a way that they close their hands completely and they possess it, which suffocates it. And it's always living. So it's living forward. And even though that's always in the perpetual present, you end up kind of sliding into the past if you're trying to hold on to something instead of allowing it to always change. And I think what's interesting is even status quo stuff where people get stuck on consistency, and consistency is wonderful, consistently in action, but the consistency of anything living always changes. And so he's talking about the green man here, the life, the birth, the death, the resurrection, all at one time. And instead of seduced by life, I love that, had become their own monkey business, so they are themselves a farce of they are themselves farces of themselves, because like the Elvis impersonating Elvis, that's become their own monkey business.
Right. And there's a few comments that I really like here. Here's pardon? What happened? Okay, here's Joel.
I said, stuck in the muck.
Yeah, here's Joel Fernando Brinco Nascimento, our friend from Brazil, who said, "Hi, Skip. Hello, Jordan. Nice to see you guys. Best regards." Richard Casper says, "If you choose Jesus as your archetype, you need nothing else to complete yourself. God of Jacob supplies everything." Michelle says, "He is risen." Michelle says, itself will run riot." Okay, so what I would say, we're talking about remains of the earlier temples. And what we see and what Jung is hinting at, because he was afraid to say it directly himself. He was the son of a pastor. And therefore, he had certain attitudes of propriety 100 years ago or 110 years ago. He didn't really come right out and say it until answer to Job, basically. But what he's saying is that the traditional religions have sort of run their course, and they're not quite holding up. Their ideals are not, they're outlived ideals that aren't holding us. And the result is 280 million people killed in the 20th century because of war. And, we're seeing the same thing happening in the 21st century, where our former president won't stick to any ideal. And so we have to pass through this time of chaos so that we can find what the new ideals will be, the new religion, if you will.
Well, and that's a good.
Well, let me just finish my thought. And so the point is that the churches know it, and they've started to trot out guitars and rock singers and you name it to keep people interested in the church. And the reality is they're losing their purchase. And so last spring when I was trying to figure out how I could bring some of the churches in Helena area into our confluence, I realized that about half of the churches that are listed for Helena, Montana, are not regular church denominations. Okay, they don't follow the traditional denominational structure of Baptist or Presbyterian or Catholic. They just don't. And so yes, they're giving you Jesus, but they're not telling you that, oh, by the way, if you're working with us, you're living Jesus's life, not your life. And so you have to find your life. And Michael says, behind Jesus is fullness. Yes, and that is served for 2,000 years. But in the 20th century, it started to break down, and we're going to see it more so, not less so. And so, yes, there will be places that call themselves Christian churches. They won't be the traditional denominations, as we've seen by the mega churches and people like Pat Robertson, who finally has left this vale of tears. And so,
Have you seen the cartoon where
No.
he shows up at the pearly gates?
And
this is the book, and he's there, and he's all wide-eyed and smiling, and God looks over and says, "You gonna tell him or me?"
Dionysus says, no real God needs prove himself. Anyone who tries is bad or lying. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't say it better.
Well, and that reminds me of I respect anyone who's searching for the truth, and I absolutely disrespect anyone who says they found it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, in any case, I suppose Jordan and I are, and Dr. Jung are all iconoclasts, and I have to admit that. But there's many parts of my spiritual life that do exist in the Protestant Church and also in the Catholic Church, and they
Well, it's funny.
it also exists in Judaism, and so yeah, Jordan.
I was to say, it's funny you say iconoclast. A professor called me that in college once in a presentation. And I went, oh, for that bonehead title to stick, I would have had to care about the rules in the first place. So, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, Richard keeps persuading us to Jesus here. And so
I think everyone needs to find their own.
Yeah, everybody has to find their own religion.
Yeah, and too much convincing means that you're trying to convince yourself, is what I'd say.
And so Richard says humans always mistakenly try to mold God to their liking, and that's our nature, I guess. But God isn't conforming to what his errant children expect. Well, that's quite true, and so.
And in modern culture, if your God hates all the people you hate, that's not a God.
Right. And yeah, I mean, Jung's his main dicta was that if you're trying to live your life according to someone else's life, you want to be like somebody else, then you're trying to live their life and not your own. And so I had a second grader the other day tell me that he's going to be an NBA star, and I said, well, NBA stars need creativity. That's what I'm teaching in this classroom. And he says, well, no, I don't. NBA stars aren't creative. And I said, you're telling me Michael Jordan isn't creative?
That's what actually sets them apart.
Right. And I don't know, the conversation went on for a couple more exchanges, and finally he says, do you realize you're talking to a second grader? So yeah.
Which, I mean, that's wise right there. I mean, yeah. I love that. I love the wisdom. I mean, out of the mouths of babes, it's like that's pretty savvy.
Yeah. And so Dionysus says Christ is the Logos, but there are ways to go about spreading his word. And what I would say is that if you think that that Christ meant that he was the rationalist, then you're missing half of life, and you haven't understood Christ's message at all.
You also, I think, look at context with Christ, because in that time, I mean, Neptune and Capricorn, I think, it wasn't true prophet time, but he was the one kind of thing. And what's interesting is what they did is they systematically started to shame and take down all the false ones. So then they could point to him as if he was just another one. So he was, in a sense, he was the rebel rouser. He was against the status quo.
Yeah, he was the revolutionary. Absolutely.
Yeah, he was the revolutionary, which is criminal in terms of the status quo. But strategically, they were savvy. They took down the other false prophets. So then they could, like a domino, take him down with two others too. And what happened then is it's what you see on the news. And the former president, actually, what I've started to notice, he doesn't need to say anything of substance to have support. As long as he keeps moving, he's on the same pace as the news. always misinforming, always misinforming. Every once in a while, there's a subtle kernel that's good. But as long as he doesn't stop, he's imitating what the sound bites people see in the media. And it doesn't matter what he says, it's familiar. So it makes them comfortable, though they don't understand what he's really doing is actually tearing down more like pre-World War II.
And I don't, there's no balance in that individual.
And substance.
Right.
No substance.
So Michael says Jung was also comfortable beyond good and evil. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think the quote
Big Cat says, yeah, the Red Book is in some ways a continuation of Thus Spake Zarathustra, and certainly it is a response in part to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche said God is dead and we have killed him, not in Zarathustra, but in I don't know, the Gay Science, I think, or something. So Nietzsche said God is dead, and Jung's found the living God where she lives and how she goes about doing the work of the Godhead. Okay, and that's the point of Jung, that when he's asked, do you believe in God? And he says, I have no need to believe, I know. When I heard him say that for the first time on the video that's on YouTube, I had an immediate reaction, which is, I know too. I don't have to believe, I know. And
that's the intuition.
And that's what you have to look for in your life. The knowing. When do you know?
And with knowing, like intuition, the reasons are unreasonable. If the reasons are too reasonable, it's not that. And so the deep knowing is gut. And what happens is then you're living it. It's living within you rather than I figured this out, A plus B equals C kind of thing. Because if you can prove
and so Richard says, I'm very sorry if I'm pushing Christianity, but if you go deeper into it, God reveals many truths to you that others do not get. And Richard, your point is well acknowledged. I agree with you. And it's Christianity, like Judaism and Buddhism and many other spiritual traditions, have deep roots in the psyche. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita, which refers to an instant in time. Okay, the whole Bhagavad Gita is about an instant in time, and it has been read and spoken and respoken over and over again for over 5,000 years. Okay, it was written down only 2,000 years before Christ. And before that, it was passed by oral tradition. And so there is depth and truth in all spiritual paths. Absolutely. They're just, if you have any doubt about that, then you may be following the wrong YouTube channel. But the fact is that all spiritual paths have deep truths within them. And the truth is that's enough for most people. Okay, most people don't get to the bottom of it and of their own spiritual path, whatever it is. They never get to that bottom of it, and they find plenty of wisdom in all of it. And so For the average person, that can be enough. For us in the Jungian path, that's not quite enough, okay? Because in a way, we're kind of beyond the fray, not above it, but beyond it. And that means that we're looking within ourselves for the truth.
And what's interesting about that, the Jungian path is actually ironic because the Jungian path leads you to your path. And that's everything lives within. Anything you need is there. And so there's a point of following Jung for long enough that then he becomes an historical friend rather than the leader. And I think the Jungian way is your way, which is very Zen. It just simply is. And
yes, it is. And Michelle says it helps her in insomnia. I think she refers to Christianity there. And Richard says, I tried the pagan ways. All I found was terror. And, I'm not suggesting that there's not error in life. Surely there is error. And if you go a pagan way without a spiritual side to your life, you'll probably be one of the drug statistics we have every year. We killed 110,000 people last year in the U.S. on fentanyl. And now I read yesterday that there's a new thing that uses fentanyl within it. And I don't even know what it is, but I don't want to name it.
Well, in the presentation we had from the iconographer several years ago, I cannot remember her name, but she tracked the path of literally the loss of the goddess into language, going from Hokmah, the Hebrew, high-powered feminine noun, to Sophia, translated into the Greek, and wisdom, and then it went to Pneuma, Pneuma, which is neutral, then turned to capital L, Logos, high-powered masculine noun, and then Spiritus Sanctus. But she tracked it further. When it got to Novgorod in Russia, they wouldn't have the loss of the pagan. They would take the spiritual piece in. But the thing is, I remember her very clearly saying, yeah, that's fine in the Mediterranean to lose the nature part. Because if you have a bad crop in the winter, you just go fishing. Whereas in Novgorod, if they had a bad crop, they died in the winter.
Yeah,
so
sure.
The need for nature to be continually, the pagan piece, continually present in the spirituality creates that life-affirming spirituality rather than an ecclesiastical belief-centered structure.
Yeah.
Dionysian
says perennialism, mayhaps. I'm of a mind with Seneca, who said, quote, he who would arrive at the appointed end must follow a single road and not wander through many ways. And, to a point, I accept that.
Well, also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Stoicism has become highly popular, like mainstream popular these days.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about most of the quotes is they relieve themselves of the history of Stoicism, that they were collected and connected to all. So that these quotes came from this life experience and from strange places within and connected in a collective. So they're often presenting just the last fruit on the tree, but they're not showing the tree. So that one path is the trickster to mean your path, not a single narrow, 1 foot in front of the other path. It's living your path is the single path rather than I have to be contained and constricted. And
I have to read this next paragraph because this is on point. Page 273. After the cursing comes laughter, so that the soul is saved from the dead. Ideals are, according to their essence, desired and pondered, They exist to this extent, but only to this extent. Yet their effective being cannot be denied. He who believes he is really living his ideals or believes he can live them suffers from delusions of grandeur and behaves like a lunatic in that he stages himself as an ideal. But the hero has fallen. Ideals are mortal. So one should prepare oneself for their end. At the same time, it probably costs you your neck. For do you not see that it was you who gave meaning, value, and effective force to your ideal? If you have become a sacrifice to the ideal, then the ideal cracks open, plays carnival with you, and goes to hell on Ash Wednesday. The ideal is also a tool that can put aside any time, a torch on dark paths. But whoever runs around with a torch by day is a fool. How much my ideals have come down, and how freshly my tree greens. I think
I love that you read that.
Let's just leave that as spoken, and go on, because I think, we can't really add anything to that. I mean, do you accept that, Jordan?
Well, it gives me credence to sometimes I leave my lamps on my table during the day and people ask why. And now I can have this paragraph here, read this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. After the cursing comes laughter. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So reading on, there's a footnote. The draft and corrected draft I had become a victim of my sanctuaries and beauties, and so I died miserable and depressed. Therefore, death came to me. That isn't in the Red Book. That's in the footnotes to the Red Book. So we go on. When I turned green, they stood there, the sad remains of earlier temples and rose gardens, and I recognized with a shudder their inner affinity. It seemed to me that they had established an indecent alliance. But I understood that this alliance had already existed for a long time, at a time when I still claimed that my sanctuaries were of crystal purity, and when I compared my friends to the perfume of the roses of Persia. Both of them formed an alliance of mutual silence. They seemed to scatter, but secretly they worked together. The solitary silence of the temple lured me away from men to the supernatural mysteries in which I lost myself to the point of surfeit. And while I struggled with God, the devil prepared himself for my reception and tore me just as far as his side. There, too, I found no boundaries other than surfeit and disgust. I did not live, but was driven. I was a slave to my ideals. What comes to mind for me is in terms of the remains of earlier temples, is Goa in India. Goa is a place on the west coast of India. And the Jesuits landed in Goa about 1650 or so, 1649, 1650, and began a Catholic church there. And then many Protestant denominations also started churches there and built churches. And so within about a 5 square mile area in Goa, you find, I think it's 14 or 15 churches. Okay. However, I think there are only 2 that are still in operation. One is the Catholic Cathedral, which is still in operation. And I think there is one Protestant denomination. And then you can go on a tour of the other churches that have gone out of business. And oh my God, it's like the jungle has taken them over. And it's like a visit to Planet of the Apes. Okay, except scary, scary Planet of the Apes. I mean, you're in three canopy jungle there, and you drive through the place, and all of a sudden these churches emerge, which have been taken over by the jungle, and oh my God, it's just unspeakably eerie to see that. And those are the remains of earlier temples, absolutely. So if you want to have an unusual experience in India, go to Goa. It's a lot of people speak English there, and it's a very unusual place. It is a beach community, so I went hang gliding with a colleague there, unbelievably, and had a bit of a short, like, one overnight holiday there. But seeing those churches is sort of a life experience that is incomparable.
Mm-hmm.
And
There's that birth and death and resurrection all together at once, and that is raw nature, capital N nature, and that's moving, and
yeah.
which I think you bring up with that. I mean, the last line of that paragraph: "I did not live, but was driven. I was a slave to my ideals," and that slave to my ideals piece is what I feel when someone tries to push their religion down my throat. Because that's theirs, not mine. And if they're always pushing, I feel like they're being driven, but they're not driving. So back again to the navigation piece.
Right. Now, going back to a couple of the footnotes here.
May I share something, Skip?
Yeah, go ahead, Amela.
How are you doing? I wanted to share how this chapter reminds me of when the Taliban recently took control, and how they began with burning down all of their Buddhist sculptures, the sculptures of the Buddha. And it was so traumatizing for me to see that these people are so infatuated with their interpretation of the Quran and not respecting the history of their country. And this is not the first time that these major terrorist organizations did something like that. It's always history and women that are being attacked. And I also remember when my son was like only 1 year old, how ISIL was burning down all of the historical archaeological temples that were being protected by all of these archaeologists who were searching for truth, but now may never find it, because now there are even more missing pieces to the puzzle that we call the history of humanity, because of these people who identify themselves as self-righteous, who think that they're doing humanity a favor by destroying history that people created thousands of years ago. And now we no longer have that anymore. The only thing that we have left are basically particles and dust. And so now we have to heavily rely on science to know the truth. But it's very unfortunate.
Right.
That's a good point, because then the theologians who then are afraid of gnosis, self-knowledge, self-awareness, because it's bad for marketing for any church for you to actually have your own mind, your own psyche. But the
Not
thing
all
is,
churches.
no, not all churches, but what happens is they want you to have them at the helm. And the reality is, if they would realize that the discipline, even of catechism, that creates a meditation in people who don't even meditate. So there's nothing wrong with religion. It's what I find is one of the true evils is fundamentalist or fanatical ecclesiastical groups or structures like that, with the Taliban going around and destroying history. What's happening is they're cutting off the lifeline to all the historical friends who have done wonderful things that will teach people things from way back when. And then people have to start all over again in a way, and act as if, oh, look, it's the first. No, it's not the first time. That's happened every 2,000 years, kind of. So I think not all religions, but I think what happens, the ones that scare tactic, the ones that say, oh, you have to do, and that's a slave to an ideal. And to me, that's pesky idealism.
Radicalism is never a revolution.
Right. Because when someone is an anarchist, what happens when they finally take over? Well, they put in a government again. So the revolution ends up not creating a whole lot of new. It just creates a lot of death.
Yeah. All right. So let me read these two footnotes. He was referring to the rose petals, and the footnote is, in Persia, the crushed petals of rose were steam distilled to make rose oil, from which perfumes were made. And it's interesting. One of my friends who is going to come to Confluence now, I think, is named Khushbu, and Khushbu comes from Persian, and it refers to the scent the scent in the air. And so and in the movie A Dangerous Method, at the end, Jung is talking about his relationship with his wife and with Tony Wolfe, and one of the last things he says is that his wife is the foundation of his house, and Tony is like the perfume in the air at the end of that movie. Footnote 90, in 1926, Jung wrote, "The transition from morning to afternoon is a transvaluation of earlier values. From this comes the necessity to appreciate the value of the opposite of our former ideals, to recognize the error in former truth, and to feel how much antagonism and even hatred lay in what had formerly passed for love for us." Okay, so reading on now. And this, and I'm going to try to get through another couple of pages here, so that maybe I'm not. Well, let me read the 3 pages, and then we'll consider whether it's worth going another few minutes. But what about men? What about mankind? There are, I'm sorry. I have to read the previous paragraph. Yeah. And thus they stood there, the ruins, quarreling with one another and unable to reconcile themselves to their common misery. Within myself, I had become one as a natural thing, a being, but I was a hobgoblin who frightened the solitary wanderer and who avoided the places of men. But I greened and bloomed from within myself. I had still not become a man again, who carried within himself the conflict between a longing for the world and a longing for the spirit. I did not live either of these longings, but I lived myself and was a merrily greening tree in a remote spring forest. And thus I learned to live without the world and spirits, and I was amazed how well I could live like this. But what about men? What about mankind? There they stood, the two deserted bridges that should lead across to mankind. One leads from above to below, and men glide down on it, which pleases them. The other leads from below to above, and mankind groans upward on it. This causes them trouble. We drive our fellow men to trouble and joy. If I myself do not live, but merely climb, it gives others undeserved pleasure, for I simply enjoy myself. It causes others undeserved trouble. If I merely live, I am far removed from men. They no longer see me, and when they see me, they are astonished and shocked. I myself, however, quite simply living, greening, blooming, fading, stand like a tree always in the same spot, and let the suffering and the joy of men pass over me with equanimity. And yet I am a man who cannot excuse himself from the discord of the human heart. But my ideals can also be my dogs, whose yapping and squabbling do not disturb me. But at least then I am good, and I am a good and a bad dog to men. But I have not yet achieved what should be, namely, that I live and yet am a man. It seems to be nearly impossible to live as a man. As long as you are not conscious of yourself, you can live. But if you become conscious of yourself, you fall from one grave into another. All your rebirths could ultimately make you sick. The Buddha therefore finally gave up on rebirth, for he had had enough of crawling through all human and animal forms. After all, the rebirths, you still remain the lion crawling on the earth, and the chameleon, a caricature, one prone to changing colors, a crawling, shimmering lizard, but precisely not a lion, whose nature is related to the sun, who draws his power from within himself, who does not crawl around in the protective colors of the environment, and who does not defend himself by going into hiding. I recognize the chameleon and no longer want to crawl on the earth and change colors and be reborn. Instead, I want to exist from my own force, like the sun, which gives light and does not suck light. That belongs to the earth. I recall my solar nature and would like to rush to my rising, but ruins stand in my way. They say, with regard to men, you should be thus and that. My chameleon-esque skin shudders. They obtrude upon me and want to color me. But that should no longer be. Neither good nor evil shall be my masters. I push them aside and laughable survivors and go on my way again, which leads me to the east. The quarreling powers that for so long stood between me and myself lie behind me. Henceforth, I am completely alone. I can no longer say to you, listen, or you should, or you could, but now I talk only with myself. Now no one else can do anything more for me, nothing whatsoever. I no longer have a duty toward you, and you no longer have duties toward me, since I vanish and you vanish from me. I no longer hear requests and no longer make requests of you. I no longer fight and reconcile myself with you, but place silence between you and me. Your call dies Oh, your call dies away in the distance, and you cannot find my footprints. Together with the west wind, which comes from the plains of the ocean, I journey across the green countryside. I roam through the forests and bend the young grass. I talk with trees and the forest wildlife, and the stones show me the way. When I thirst and the source does not come to me, I go to the source. When I starve and the bread does not come to me, I seek my bread and take it where I find it. I provide no help and need no help. If at any time necessity confronts me, I do not look around to see whether there is a helper nearby. But I accept the necessary and bend and writhe and struggle. I laugh, I weep, I swear, but I do not look around me. On this way, no one walks behind me, and I cross no one's path. I am alone, but I fill my solitariness with my life, and I am man enough. I am noise, conversation, comfort, and help enough unto myself. And so I wandered to the far east. Not that I knew anything about what my distant goal might be. I see blue horizons before me. They suffice as a goal. I hurry toward the east and my rising. I will my rising. All right, so that's the end of what I was going to read on the remains of the earlier temples. Did you have any comments on this at the end?
I think that just reading that straight through just pretty much restates what we've had the whole 2 hours here today.
Yep.
I think it's a great summary and a great talk about, someone feeling alien to themselves. What do they do? These pages, and the transformation, and the one way is your way. I think this is just a great summary and a great place to stop for this week, because this just really recaptures everything I think we've talked about today.
Yeah. Mela?
Yeah. It's a very loaded chapter. I have a lot to say. Like encountering the red one, it's like Jung himself encountering, if he even is Jung. Like, we don't even know who Jung is right now, because maybe he's dissociating as he's writing this, or I don't know if this was like past tense or in the moment or a memory. We don't really know what's going on here. Is he speaking of experience? Is he like philosophizing his experiences? Is he speaking of something that happened yesterday or something that happened 20 years ago? I don't know, but I do know that he's saying a lot of things here that men have and women, that humans have. This is like the human condition, if you will. He's so fed up, if that's appropriate to say.
Yeah.
He's so fed up with this never-ending cycle of these duties and responsibilities that he has to always conform and this is your role, this is my role, I know what our roles are, and but what is the purpose of society and structure? He's really trying to understand his truth, to understand his reality. What is going on around me, and is everything that I've ever learned going out the window now because of all of this violence that will never end? Because historically, human beings will forever have a war. Unfortunately, we're always going to war with something, whether it's like a spiritual war or a literal war with death and violence. any kind of war, there's always some kind of protesting, always at odds, always disagreeing. And so he's trying to understand, but he knows that this is not something new. This has happened before. So then he thinks about Buddha, and he reflects on Buddha's rebirth and how I really like that Herman Hesse Siddhartha book.
Yeah.
And when Siddhartha is sort of like in between being a little bit selfish, but then also like playful, and then he wants to be a little bit greedy in rice and fruit, but then he's not really, like, he preserves himself and maintains.
Oh,
Yeah, we lost Mela.
must have cut off.
I'm sorry about that. Because go ahead. Go ahead, Charlie.
I say I'm going to need to go in a couple minutes.
Yeah, me too. I think we all need to go. And is the weather good there these days?
It is. I'm heading over that way to the plaza, and then some lunch with a friend of mine, and then back onto the plaza.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a good day. And,
you too. Thank you.
And by the way, for everybody else, the Confluence is not yet receiving reservations. I expect that to be completed within this week, and that will be live on the where page of the website by the end of this coming week, I hope. But we've been figuring out how to get it done, and I think we've finally done it. And but anyway, that shouldn't stop you from looking at the Confluence website and seeing what we're doing. So Amela came back to us, and so you want to finish your thought, Amela, and Jordan, you can go.
I've got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, take care.
Amela.
Yeah, go.
Thank you, Jordan.
So Amela, we'll let you and I finish it up, and go ahead.
Much. I'm so sorry. So he basically breaks away from the cycle by metaphorically saying, let me go into these waves of what's happening, like I can't fight the current, so let the current just go, let the current be. You can't fight nature, just let it happen.
Yep.
And I can relate to that because I know that I'm not the only one. There is also other people who sometimes are at a disbelief with a situation, and you just cannot believe that something is happening, but there it is. You've reached the edge of the cliff. There's no more places to climb. There's no place to hike anymore. Like, that's it. You've reached the end. Like, what do you do now? And the best thing to do is to reflect within yourself. And he's not ruminating. He's not saying like, well, he kind of is in a way, because he's trying to understand like the meaning of man, but at the same time, he's not really beating himself up in a negative kind of way, but in a sort of productive way where he's attempting to understand where the balance is between the good, the evil, and the purpose of it all. So that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that the balance is always within us. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not ever going to be a fine balance that will balance all of us or everything. At least not for several thousand years, I would think. And because we always have these ebbs and flows, we always have crises that come up and screw up all your plans one way or another. And so we have to find the balance within us. And however you do that is your way. Okay, that's okay. You know, however you find the balance. And just remember that all things that are unbalanced, all things that are unbalanced are unhealthy for the group.
And don't be hard on yourself, don't beat
Yeah.
yourself up. Sometimes it's just the process of nothing and being, right? Being
Right.
in nothingness, just being present and
Right.
aware.
Sure. And Jung made this comment that what's probably better said by Mary Oliver in the Wild Geese. She said, "You don't have to be good. You don't have to crawl on your knees for 100 miles. You only have to be your being." I forget how it goes exactly. But anyway, I can probably get it in a half a second here. But she really summed it up. And so let's see if I can find the poem here quickly. Okay, here it is. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscape, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting. Over and over again, announcing your place in the family of things.
Yeah, it's nothing new.
Yeah,
There's no stone unturned. Well, maybe there is, but someone's probably already turned it over.
yeah. Well, there are 8 billion of us, and all of us are somewhere on that journey. And we can't change everybody. I don't try to change everybody. I used to write left-wing polemics essays, and I published a book of them, and I made a website that includes a couple hundred of my essays. And the world just goes on. It made me feel better, but I don't think it changed anybody. And so, I don't really try to change anyone anymore. I just try to talk about what Jung means to me, and every week it's something else. And I've heard tell that there are analysts who've never read the Red Book because they considered Jung's private diary, basically. And I've read it several times online. I have marked my reader's edition copy up very deeply. And it touches me very deeply every time I read it. And that's why I do it. And that's why I make it available to this group as regularly as I can. So anyway, I'm blessed. I've been blessed, and I have no need to believe I know, and I wish that state for everyone. That's what I can say. So peace. Thank you for joining me. And nice
Thank
to see
you.
you today. And Jordan's got to go read some tarot today, so he's got his own